I never imagined that moment would completely alter the course of my life. It started like any other day until I entered that room and noticed the door ajar. In that instant, something inside me shifted. I could have walked away, ignored it, but I didn't. When I realized what I was seeing, I knew nothing would be the same again. Yes, I was responsible because I was the one who initiated everything and failed to stop it. George was at work and the house was quiet, but I heard faint noises coming from upstairs. At first, I didn't give it much thought. It was just another moment of a young man lost in his own thoughts. Maybe he'd like some coffee. A little chat could be nice. As I walked up the stairs, I tried to pinpoint the source of the sounds. When I reached his room, I noticed the door was slightly open. I took a deep breath, about to call out, but then my gaze fell on Elliot. He was sitting on his bed, a laptop on his lap, the screen casting a bright glow on his face. His hands were moving, and for a moment, I thought he was just watching something thrilling, maybe an action film. But as I stepped closer, changing my angle, I felt my blood drain from my face. It was then I understood exactly what Elliot was doing. The reflection on the screen hit me like a cold wave, and I wasn't prepared for it. I didn't want to see this. Elliot scrambled to compose himself, hurriedly lowering the volume on his laptop, but it was too late. The moment had already passed. Our eyes met, and his face flushed with shame impossible to hide. "I'm sorry," he stammered, looking away. I felt paralyzed, unsure of what to say. I should have knocked," I started, but I didn't know what I was trying to say. A strange warmth spread through me. I was embarrassed, yes, but my mind was racing, unable to grasp what was happening. I quickly stepped out of the room, my heart pounding. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to steady my breathing. "What was that?" I whispered. What had I done? Why had I been so reckless? But was I the only one to blame here? "Stop it, Darlene," I told myself firmly. But the chaos inside me wasn't just from what I'd seen. Elliot was 23 now, no longer a child, and I was 47, a woman who had experienced her fair share of shame in life. I'd never found myself in a situation like this, but I knew what shame felt like. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart still racing, and ran my fingers through my hair, trying to regain control. Then, Elliot appeared at the doorway. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, cleared his throat, and avoided eye contact. "Darlene, I'm sorry, I thought I had closed the door," he said, his voice unsure but sincere. I quickly shook my head, looking away. No. Actually, I should apologize. I should have knocked before entering," I said hurriedly, not really knowing what else to say. Silence. But this wasn't just any silence. We'd lived in the same house for years, yet this was the first time we'd ever looked at each other like this, the first time there was such tension between us. "I'll go downstairs and start preparing dinner," I said, quickly turning toward the stairs, my voice trembling as I tried to hold myself together. Elliot didn't respond. He simply watched me with his eyes, as if trying to piece something together in his mind. Before things escalated further between us, I was reminded to subscribe to my channel, turn on notifications, and stay tuned until the end. Trust me, things were about to get much more intense. That evening we didn't speak. No texts, no eye contact, no small talk. The silence whispered that nothing would ever be the same. At dinner, we sat across from each other, unable to meet each other's gaze. The only sound was the clinking of silverware. We both knew we needed to talk, but neither of us knew how. The night passed, then the next day and the one after that. Everything seemed normal, but nothing truly was. Our silence only made the unspoken tension grow stronger. One afternoon, Elliot sat down next to me, his hesitation evident in his eyes, but it was clear he wanted to resolve things. "Darlene, about the other day, I'm really embarrassed. I'm sorry. I didn't want things to be this way. Please, I don't want this to ruin things between us," he said, his voice nervous but sincere. I took a deep breath. As strange and unexpected as this was, I knew I needed to calm him down. I smiled and shrugged slightly. "Oh, Elliot, believe me, I've had my share of embarrassing moments over the years," I said, sharing a few of them with him. He smiled a little, nodding, and his embarrassment seemed to fade. It felt like the tension between us had lifted, but deep down I knew things hadn't really changed. This conversation had erased all boundaries, and I could sense things were about to move much further. Elliot let out a small chuckle, looking down at the table. "I guess we're even now," he said quietly. I frowned and turned to him, curiosity creeping into my voice. "What do you mean?" I asked. For a second, his expression changed, like he realized he had said something irreversible. He rubbed the back of his neck, unsure, but now that he had started, he had to continue. "I've seen you the same way. You just didn't know," he muttered, looking away. My body froze as his words hit me like an electric shock. "What?" I whispered, my mind reeling. Elliot's face was flushed, but he pressed on. "I never told you because I was too embarrassed, but it was my little secret, something I couldn't shake. I never forgot about it." My heart raced as strange warmth spread inside me. Elliot's words weren't just a confession. They shattered the last boundaries between us. We looked at each other, and by now we both understood. This was no longer an ordinary conversation. The air in the room had thickened, and everything had changed. From that moment forward, everything was different. Before, there had always been some invisible boundary between us, but now it felt like it had completely disappeared. Without realizing it, I began spending more time with Elliot. Small moments, innocent conversations, but each one only added fuel to the tension. We even watched movies together now. Before, we had kept our distance, but now there was a pull, unspoken but undeniable. Sometimes when his arm brushed mine, or when our laughter intertwined, I felt something stir inside me, but I tried not to dwell on it. One night I couldn't sleep. Tossing and turning, restlessness consumed me, and there was only one thing on my mind: Elliot. I couldn't keep going like this. I had to set a boundary. If he had feelings for me, I had to confront it head on and put a stop to it. I got out of bed, my heart racing, but my feet carried me straight to Elliot's room. His door was slightly open, dim light spilling from inside. As I stepped in, I saw him sleeping, but my eyes weren't on him. They were focused on something else. My breath caught in my throat. I froze for a moment. Seeing him like that ignited something inside me. I shouldn't have seen it. I should have turned away, but I didn't. I stood there trying to process what I was feeling, then quickly pulled back. Something inside me wanted to take over, but I ignored it. I returned to my room, lay down, but nothing felt the same anymore. I had no idea how much more complicated things were about to become. No matter what I did, the closeness with Elliot continued to grow. Day by day, the lines blurred, and the attraction between us became harder to ignore. I didn't even realize when things had escalated this far, but I knew one thing: turning back was no longer an option. Then, one evening, Elliot came home in a drunken state. The noise from the door and the things he knocked over could have woken George, but I knew how difficult it was for George to stir. I hurried out of my room and went to Elliot. I didn't have time to fix my clothes before I was by his side. His eyes were unfocused and he smiled faintly. "Darlene, are you real?" he mumbled, his words slurred but sincere. I took a deep breath and grabbed his arm. "Elliot, come on. You can't go upstairs like this. We have to be quiet." His eyes remained fixed on me, his smile softening. "You're beautiful." "Have you always been this way, or did I just never notice?" I froze for a second, but quickly recovered. "Elliot, that's enough. Come to the kitchen. I'll make you some coffee." I led him there, trying to sober him up, but his gaze and the things he said were affecting me too. Elliot sat in a chair while I prepared the coffee, but suddenly the cup slipped from his hands and spilled. "Ah, Elliot, you need to be more careful," I whispered, quickly cleaning it up. But he smiled softly. "Were you always this sweet?" I hurried to finish cleaning, as we couldn't stay in the kitchen much longer. George was upstairs, and with Elliot in this state, we had to stay quiet. I helped him upstairs, his movements even more unsteady. He needed to change, but he was too out of it to manage on his own. At first, I hesitated, but instinctively helped him when I saw him struggle. As my fingers reached for his shirt's buttons, the air between us thickened, and the tension became unbearable. I knew exactly what I was doing, yet I felt lost. Elliot's gaze had changed, and this moment couldn't be undone. "I'm not playing this game anymore, Darlene," he said softly but firmly. I stared at him, heart pounding, unsure of what he meant. "Are you?" he asked, his voice deepening. A shiver ran through me, making me step back, but I couldn't move. "Elliot, this isn't right," I said, my voice trembling. He smiled, but it wasn't innocent. "We passed the point of deciding what's right long ago. Stop lying to yourself," he said, taking a step closer. He was so near now that I could feel his breath on my skin. He reached up, gently tracing my cheek. I wanted to look away but couldn't because deep down I knew he was right. Then his lips found mine, and all the silence and tension were answered in that single moment. I hadn't resisted. In truth, I had never wanted to. My hands trembled, but I didn't pull away. When I saw the determination in his eyes, I knew there was nothing left to hide. "You're right, Elliot," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Let's not play this game anymore." I slid my clothing off my shoulders as he leaned over me. His smile reassured me, but I still couldn't stop the shiver that ran through me. I had been waiting for this moment, but I couldn't admit it to myself. "Elliot, I'm a little scared," I whispered, my voice unsteady. He smiled, brushing off my words. "Everything is fine," he said. "Everything is great." But I couldn't stop the fear. Still, I closed my eyes, clutching the sheets, trembling. I didn't care about anything anymore. Elliot was tired and drunk, but I couldn't stop myself. The excitement and everything else had taken over. By the time we were done, I felt a rush unlike anything I had ever experienced. I quickly laid Elliot down in his bed, covered him up, and locked the door. I wanted to shower and relax, but as I stood in the bathroom, I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. It was a chaotic moment, yet I felt calm. I dressed in silence, walked to my bed, and went to sleep as if nothing had happened. But I knew the truth. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of excitement. Bigger things were on the horizon. And one way or another, George would find out. This story isn't over yet. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. Your support means everything to me. Thanks for listening. Certain roads lead to places you never imagined. Sometimes, a single decision alters the course of your entire life, and often you don't fully grasp how wrong a path feels until you've already taken the first step. I spent years trying to make the right decisions, and when I married Anderson, I was 38. Before that, I always dreamed of creating a family and giving my future child a warm, loving home. However, Anderson never shared those dreams. At the beginning, he made all the promises a husband should. He said we would build a life together. But over time, I came to realize that I was merely a shadow in his world. Anderson never truly valued me or the family we could have created. His job, his schedule, his rigid routines, they all took priority. In the beginning, I lied to myself, hoping he would change, hoping one day he'd recognize the emptiness that was growing inside me. But no, Anderson never changed. He remained the same, and with each passing year, I felt lonelier. Then there was Drake, Anderson's son from his first marriage. When we met, Drake was 19, just starting college, ambitious, determined, full of potential. Anderson kept his distance from him, thinking that providing money was all that being a father meant. But Drake wanted more than that. He wanted to prove himself, to carve his own way. He was everything Anderson wasn't, and before I realized it, I found myself paying close attention to him. When Drake was nearing graduation, he made a decision that shocked everyone. Everyone expected him to take a high-paying engineering job, but instead, he said he wanted to become a mechanic. Anderson went into a rage when he found out, yelling, even threatening to cut him off financially. I still remember the echoes of that argument shaking the walls of our home. That night, Drake left after graduation, packed his things and walked out without a word. I never got to say goodbye. I never asked where he was going. If I had let myself show how much it hurt to see him leave, I would have had to admit something I wasn't ready to face. 2 years have passed since then, and I've only seen him a few times. The bond we once had was gone, and it wasn't meant to be. Tonight, as I sat in my broken-down car on a dark, rainy road, I realized there was no one else I could call. I didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. It would go farther than I ever expected, and it would happen all on its own. I picked up my phone, my fingers instinctively hovering over Anderson's number, but within seconds I hesitated. Even if he picked up, wasn't it obvious what he'd say? "Call a tow truck, Cameron. I'm far away." He would hang up without a second thought. I swallowed hard and stared at the screen for a few seconds before backing out of the call and scrolling to another name, Drake. A strange unease stirred inside me. My finger hovered over his contact. Should I call him? Was this just a call for help, or was there something else? Something unspoken? The rain tapped lightly on the windows, and then, in the glow of my headlights, I saw a tall, strong figure approaching through the dark. A strange sense of relief washed over me. Drake reached the car and knocked on the window. As I rolled it down just a little, his familiar, steady voice came through. "Cameron, you okay?" His face was slightly damp from the rain, his features sharper than I remembered. His stance was effortless but strong. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was a man. And in these 2 years, it wasn't just the distance between us that had changed. He had changed. "Yeah, I'm fine." The car stopped suddenly. I didn't know what to do. I was visiting my mom, and on the way back, Anderson's out of town again. I didn't call him because I already know what he'd say. "Call a tow truck, Cameron." He'd probably even get annoyed about it. If this is your first time hearing confessions like this, make sure to join our channel and subscribe with notifications on before moving forward. You'll find yourself wishing this story never ends, Drake said, tilting his head slightly, understanding in his eyes. "I know why you didn't call him," he added calmly. "Don't worry, I got this." He leaned forward, popping the hood and shining his flashlight over the engine. I watched his hands move with precision, his muscles flexing with each controlled motion. He wasn't just a college kid anymore. There was confidence in every movement, experience in how he handled the situation. "It's pretty clear this isn't getting fixed here," he said finally, shutting the hood. "We'll have to take it to the garage. I'll drive it because the steering might be stiff. You'll sit in the passenger seat and I'll leave my truck here. I'll come back for it later." I didn't question it. I didn't need to because I knew that with Drake here, everything would be okay. The air was humid during the drive, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like it was drawing us closer without us even realizing it. Drake would glance over at me from time to time, and his voice remained steady as he told me things. He kept the conversation flowing, filling the silence with that same effortless ease he always had. I listened, observing him. How his hands controlled the steering wheel, the sound of his voice, his presence right there beside me. When he left 2 years ago, I never admitted to myself how much his absence had left a void inside me. Anderson had always been distant, but Drake's presence had been different. His energy, his voice, his eyes, even back then, something inside me had been waking up. I just hadn't been ready to acknowledge it. I remembered the night before he left. There had been something between us, a connection that never crossed the line but had always been there. And now Drake was back, older, more mature, and more magnetic than ever. A quiet unease stirred inside me. This feeling, whatever it was, felt forbidden. It wasn't supposed to be here, but it was. And no matter how hard I tried to suppress it, I could feel it in every breath I took when he was near. By the time we arrived at the garage, I took a deep breath, trying to regain control of myself as I opened the car door. But there was a voice inside me whispering, "Tonight you're both different and you both know it." The garage smelled of motor oil and metal, and the rhythmic sound of rain tapping against the roof filled the space. Drake lifted his head from under the hood, wiping sweat from his forehead before turning to face me. There was no exhaustion in his eyes, just a thoughtful expression. "It's getting late," he said. "If I start working on the car now, we'll be here all night. It's better to take care of it in the morning." I nodded. It wasn't a problem, but something about the way Drake stood there made it clear that this wasn't just any ordinary night. "The rain's coming down harder," he added. "Stay here." I'll go with a friend to pick up my truck. Then I'll come back to take you home. I don't want you out here alone in this." His voice carried a quiet authority, the kind of attention to detail that Anderson never had. He wouldn't have cared. He would have expected me to figure it out. But Drake was different. When he stepped out, the silence of the garage settled over me. The rain pounded on the roof while I sat, folding my hands in my lap. Logically, I should have been annoyed or stressed. My car had broken down. I was getting home late. My plans were ruined. But strangely, I didn't care. If anything, I felt at peace. More than that, I felt happy. Why? This was just a car breakdown. It was an ordinary situation, but tonight, nothing felt ordinary. The way Drake looked at me, the warmth in his voice, his presence, something inside me was shifting. The rumble of an engine outside interrupted my thoughts. Drake pulled up in front of the garage, stepping inside with water dripping from his shoulders. Completely unfazed by the rain, he looked at me. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes locking with mine. I stood up, pulling my jacket tighter around me, then nodded. We walked outside together and got into the car. As we drove, the feeling inside me only grew stronger. I turned to him, trying to find the words to express what I was feeling. "You know," I said with a slight smile, "when something like this happens, most people get frustrated or worried, or they feel unlucky. But I don't feel that way. In fact, strangely enough, I feel happy." Drake smiled slightly, keeping his eyes on the road. "I get it," he said. "Sometimes, even at the wrong times, things can feel right." His voice was soft, but there was something deeper in it. It was like the walls I had built around my loneliness were crumbling. In that moment, I realized just how distant Anderson had really been, how alone I felt even when he was right beside me. And more than that, I realized Drake knew it too. The tension between us was undeniable now, and I felt a quiet, persistent whisper inside me. I didn't want this night to end. As we neared my house, I took a deep breath and gathered my courage. "Drake," I said, "you've been dealing with this for hours. You must be starving. Come inside. Let's have dinner together like old times." Drake looked at me for a moment, silent. There was a brief hesitation and then that familiar warm smile. "How could I say no to that?" he said, and something inside me caught fire. When we stepped inside, I started preparing dinner in the kitchen. All the stress I should have felt from the night disappeared. We were laughing together, talking about old memories, reminiscing as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Every time our eyes met, we both knew it. And there was no going back. It felt so easy, so familiar. But the atmosphere between us had shifted. Drake leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his arms as he observed me closely. There was warmth in his gaze, yet something else lingered too. Something playful, something knowing. "I have to admit," he said, a slight grin on his face, "you look just as stunning as ever. Actually, it's hard to believe, but it feels like you've gotten even younger in the past 2 years. If I didn't know you, I'd swear you were 30 at most. I'd probably be trying to charm you right now." I chuckled, caught off guard by his casual tone. The unexpected compliment flustered me, but I couldn't deny how much I enjoyed it. "Well, thank you, but I'm 45, Drake," I replied, still smiling. "There's nearly 20 years between us." "Age is just a number, Cameron," he said, his voice softening. "We both know that." His words sent a rush of warmth through me and the table fell into silence. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick, almost like something was about to break. Drake tilted his head, his eyes studying me as if he could see into something deeper, something neither of us could keep ignoring. "You've changed too," I finally said, trying to steer the conversation in a new direction. "When you left, I could tell you were starting to mature, but now you're a man." The smile slowly faded from Drake's face, replaced by a more serious expression. He placed his hand on the table, fingers tracing the surface, and after a brief pause, he looked directly into my eyes and spoke. "I had feelings for you, Cameron." Something inside me tightened instantly. "Drake!" I started, but he cut me off. "I know I shouldn't say this," he continued, "but I can't hide it anymore. When I left that house, I thought if I stayed away and respected you, I'd forget. I thought it was just something temporary, that it would fade with time. But it didn't." He took a deep breath, his gaze pulling me in, holding me captive. And now, seeing you like this, so alone, it's killing me inside. My heart pounded so hard, it felt as though everything around me was splitting into two. One side urged me to run, while the other, the part of me I barely recognized, wanted nothing more than to stay and listen to every word he was saying. Drake, I couldn't finish the sentence. His eyes locked onto mine with such intensity I felt like I couldn't breathe. Without thinking, I reached across the table, my fingers brushing his hand. He caught my hand in his skin warm and firm. In that moment, everything else seemed to stop. We moved in sync, leaning toward each other, stealing one final glance before our lips met. At first, it was slow and uncertain, but soon all the tension we had suppressed for years was released at once. Drake cupped my face gently, pulling me closer, and instinctively, my body pressed toward his. The more I felt his warmth, the more I realized something inside me, something I hadn't felt in years, was starting to come back to life. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. Even with Drake's lips on mine, I felt something awakening inside me, something I had buried for so long. My hands moved on their own, sliding down his shoulders as he pulled me closer, firm and unshaken. I moved toward him, my gaze locked onto his. As his hand slowly moved, it sent a thrill through me, and I felt something huge building inside. Even though a deep, intense pain washed over me, I didn't care. Everything kept going. I let out loud sounds of pleasure, and as if matching my energy, Drake looked at me, his eyes full of excitement. We were perfectly in sync, and I pressed my hands against his shoulders, feeling a slight tremble in my body. I wasn't expecting this reaction, but it was clear that Drake loved it. I started begging him to stop holding back. Then he said my name, his voice softening. "Cameron," he murmured, and slowly he let go. A deep warmth spread through me as I took a deep breath, collapsing beside him. My heart was still racing, our breathing uneven, but inside I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. Being this close to him, it was like finding a missing piece of myself. Drake turned toward me, locking eyes, his hand gently tracing my face. There was certainty in his gaze, a look that assured me this was real, that this wasn't just a temporary escape. "Cameron," he said slowly, "you need to leave Anderson." Something inside me tightened. I had been waiting for these words, but even so, they hung heavily in the air. "He doesn't deserve you," Drake continued. "He never did. He left you alone for years, never showed you love, turned your life into a shadow of what it should have been. You don't deserve a life like that." I tried to respond, but he didn't let me. "If you do this, we can start over, somewhere new, in a place where no one knows us. I don't care about anything else. I love you, Cameron, and I can't stand seeing you sad, feeling alone anymore." I locked eyes with him, and the sincerity in his voice, the desperate longing in his eyes, shook me to my core. A warmth spread inside me, and for the first time in years, I felt hope. Was this an escape? Maybe. But it was also an opportunity for a happiness I had never known before. I took a deep breath and smiled. Drake. The words got stuck in my throat, but in that moment, our eyes spoke for us. Our hands found each other, fingers intertwining. This story wasn't over. There was more to come, and this time it was going even further. Stay tuned to find out what happens next. If you made it this far, I know this story resonated with you deeply. There's so much more to share, and you won't want to miss any of it. Make sure to hit the follow button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment about the story.